The psychology of people who prefer being alone. You know what's interesting? We live in a world that constantly celebrates the extroverts, the social butterflies, the people who gain energy from crowds. But what about those of us who genuinely prefer our own company? Not because we're antisocial or broken, but because solitude actually feels better than being surrounded by people. If you've ever felt guilty about canceling plans to stay home, or wondered why you'd rather spend Friday night alone than at a party, this one's for you. Let's start with something that might surprise you. Preferring solitude isn't about disliking people. It's about how your brain processes stimulation. Psychologists have found that people who prefer being alone often have what's called a low threshold for stimulation. Your nervous system is like a cup that fills up throughout the day. For some people, that cup is massive and takes forever to fill. For others, it's smaller and reaches capacity much faster. Social interactions, noise, conversations, even just being in the presence of others, all of these things pour water into that cup. When you prefer being alone, your cup simply fills up faster, and once it's full, continuing to socialize doesn't feel energizing. It feels draining. You're not avoiding people, you're managing your optimal level of arousal. Here's another layer. People who prefer solitude often have rich inner worlds. There's a concept in psychology called internal locus of orientation, which essentially means you derive satisfaction primarily from your own thoughts, ideas, and activities rather than from external validation or interaction. Think about it. When you're alone, you're not performing. You're not monitoring how you're being perceived. You're not code switching between different social roles. You're not expending energy on reciprocal conversation. Your mind is free to wander, create, process, and explore without interruption. That mental freedom isn't loneliness. It's liberation. Now let's talk about something called selective social investment. People who prefer being alone aren't necessarily less social, they're more selective about their social energy. Research shows that these individuals often maintain fewer relationships, but those relationships tend to be deeper and more meaningful. It's quality over quantity. You'd rather have 3 conversations that matter than 30 that don't. Every small talk interaction about the weather or weekend plans feels like a transaction with no return on investment. But a 2-hour conversation about ideas, dreams, fears, or genuine connection, that's worth the energy expenditure. You're not antisocial, you're intentionally social. There's also something fascinating happening with your reward system. Your brain's dopamine response, the chemical associated with pleasure and reward, might simply be wired differently. For highly social people, dopamine floods their system during social interaction. For those who prefer solitude, that same dopamine hit comes from solitary activities. Reading a book, working on a project, taking a solo walk. These activities light up your reward centers in ways that small talk at a networking event simply doesn't. You're not missing out on joy, you're just finding it in different places. Let's address the elephant in the room: social conditioning. From childhood, we're taught that being social is good, and being alone is somehow problematic. Group projects in school, team-building exercises at work, the constant cultural messaging that you need a packed social calendar to be happy. But here's the thing. That's not universal truth. That's cultural programming. The psychological concept of self-determination theory tells us that autonomy, the ability to be self-directed and make your own choices, is one of the 3 fundamental human needs. For some people, autonomy is best expressed in solitude. You're not defying social norms because you're damaged. You're honoring an authentic need. Consider this too. People who prefer being alone often have what psychologists call high self-sufficiency. You've developed the capacity to regulate your own emotions, entertain yourself, and find meaning without requiring constant external input. That's not a weakness, that's actually a sophisticated psychological skill. When you can sit with yourself, with your thoughts, even with discomfort, without needing distraction or validation from others, you've achieved something many people spend their whole lives trying to learn in therapy. And here's perhaps the most important piece. Preferring solitude often correlates with deep self-awareness. When you spend time alone, you're forced to confront yourself, your thoughts, your patterns, your truths. There's nowhere to hide in solitude. You can't distract yourself with other people's energy or lose yourself in group dynamics. You have to sit with who you actually are. That level of self-examination creates profound self-knowledge that's hard to develop when you're constantly externally focused. So here's what this all means. If you prefer being alone, you're not weird, you're not broken, and you're not missing out on life. You're simply someone whose optimal state involves more solitude than the average person. Your brain processes stimulation differently, finds reward in different activities, and requires autonomy to thrive. That's not a flaw in your design. That's just your design. Maybe the real question isn't why you prefer being alone. Maybe it's why we've been taught to feel guilty about it. If this resonated with you, let me know in the comments. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. Sometimes the most generous thing we can do is help someone feel less alone in their preference for solitude.